technical session number 8. As we stated a little bit earlier, we do kind of jump around in technical sessions, mostly based upon our pacing in other programs. But today or this morning, we're going to be talking about the central processing unit, which is essentially the brain of the computer. We talked about the motherboard being the backbone or the nervous system of the computer. Well, the CPU is in essence the brain. So our main objectives, how we're going to kind of go over this and work through this here a little bit, is we're going to be describing various types of processors and articulate how to select a processor to match your system needs. We're going to identify the CPU as the central processing unit. We're going to explain its purpose and the requirements to kind of keep it functioning. We're going to choose the appropriate cooling methods. We're going to be talking a little bit about cooling methods as well, and name some steps to replacing and installing a processor. We're going to identify some of the common pitfalls you might come across, and then get to a set of symptoms and identify some common CPU problems and kind of get in a little bit on solving them. All right. So, as with this in every technical session, we also like to remind ourselves about the BSMs, or behavior skills and mindsets. And the two that we want to kind of keep in mind for this one are adaptability, because as we are all aware of by now, the industry is constantly adapting and changing and moving and shaking, and we have to be able to shift our perspectives and our focuses in order to be able to keep up with this industry and also to be successful in it. And one of the best tools to kind of prepare ourselves for that is having a growth mindset, understanding that our intelligence is not fixed, that we can grow as individuals, we can learn new tricks, we can learn new skills. We don't have to be complacent with where we are at the moment. We can look forward and look ahead and say, you know what, I am capable of this. I can do this. And hopefully all of you say that, because that's why you're here, right? So, adaptability and growth mindset. So, types and characteristics of processors. They are typically installed on the motherboard, and they will determine the computing power of your system, because that is where the algorithmic processing is taking place. And there, it says 2 major manufacturers, but there are 3 main types of processors. You have your Intel, you have your AMD, and then you have your ARM processors. And we'll get into that a little bit. And each of these have a few different types and characteristics depending on the needs of your system and also your price point. So Intel, this tends to be more the enterprise type processor. They have their own desktop and laptops, and they tend to be sold under Core, Pentium, and Celeron brands. Do you need to know all the different types of processor chips? No, but you should be familiar with the brand names as they come up. So Celeron, Pentium, stuff like that, and be able to identify it with Intel or AMD. Intel tends to be rather low power, and they have their own smartphone chips, which are also called Atoms. All right, and then you have the laptop ones, which are called Centrino, and then they have the servers, which are called, was it Xeon? So some of these have gone by the wayside and improved. This is just kind of showing you the evolution of the Intel. No, you don't need to memorize this. No, you don't need to know when it came into being at 1971. This is just kind of showing you how and when they were hitting the markets. If any of y'all are Adam Savage fans, this right here is a wire mesh, and it is actually one of the first iterations, this little orange thing in the bottom, of a bit. So you had this wire mesh that was like this big, and it represented a single bit in some of the first computers, which took up like a whole warehouse. And so we went from this being a single bit down to microprocessors that could fit on the end of your finger with millions upon millions of these in them. And technologically speaking, a very, very short period of time. Moving over to AMD, these tend to be more popular in the gaming industry due to its integrated graphics processing unit. They kind of fell by the wayside in the gaming industry for just a little bit, and Intel took the lead, but AMD has recently kind of stepped back on top with that. And they have a few different families. So they have the FX, the Phenom, the Athlon, the Sempron, and the Ryzens now. And this kind of gives you a breakdown of them, where you have your value segment, which are going to be your lower end chips, and then your standards, and then you get up in all the way up into the gaming segment, which are going to be your higher end ones. Now, interestingly, it wasn't too long ago, AMD thought they would get smart, because manufacturing production lines aren't cheap. And so if you're manufacturing 4 or 5 or whatever, however many different types of chips, you have to have a production line for each one of these chips. And again, this gets expensive. So someone in their marketing group is like, hey, why don't we just create all the same chip, but we put blockages on them, software blockages, so that when they buy them, it's still, it's a lower end chip, or if they pay the higher price, then they get the higher end chip, and da-da-da-da-da. So that we only have to manufacture one line. We could save a ton of money. Well, the IT community is very interesting in this fact. They love to tinker with things, and it didn't take them very long for people to figure out that you could buy the economy chip and then just do what's called overclocking it, because it actually is a gaming chip just with some software blocks on it. So instead of saving a ton of money, they ended up losing a ton of money. I believe that was AMD that had this problem. Because again, once one person finds out, they start putting it out there, and it starts spreading very, very quickly. All right, this kind of gives you a little bit of a snapshot. Like if you look at your system settings, you can go in and see what kind of chip you have in your computer. It doesn't matter if you have a Windows, it doesn't matter if you have a Mac. You may have an Intel family, you may have an AMD family, or depending on if you have a laptop, you may have an ARM chip in there, or a tablet or a Chromebook or something along those lines. But you can go into your system settings and see exactly which family you fall in. So under your control panel system, you can go to your processor and see exactly what type of chip, and you can even see its architecture. Right here you see a 64. This one's dual core, all that fun stuff. So it has 2 CPUs within each core. This picture should look familiar to us, right? Saw this one last week, talking about motherboards. And this is just kind of a remind us that essentially the CPU is the center of the whole system. The motherboard connects everything together. The CPU is the brains of the operation. All right, so when we peel back the cover on a CPU, we're going to see a few things. So we have our input or IO unit, or input output unit. It's kind of like the, it's so that the computer can talk to the outside of the chip. So it can talk to the RAM modules, it can talk to your graphics card, all that other fun stuff, the motherboard itself. And then you have your control unit, which is like the traffic cop. It determines where the information coming in has got to speak, or where it's going to go. You have the ALUs, which is the algorithmic logic unit, and this is where the actual computations are taking place, so that we can see all the wonderful things and hear the sounds and all that fun stuff. It comes in as ones and zeros, but it has to be processed, and the ALU takes care of that. And it can't hold all of that information, and it may need to repetitively see some information. So it has an internal memory cache, which is just a place where things are stored while the algorithmic logic unit is waiting to process it. So it's kind of what it looks like inside of a CPU. And it's all kind of broken down here in the next page. You have your IO unit, manages data and instructions entering and leaving the processor. Your control unit manages all the activities, so it's kind of like the traffic cop. The ALUs are algorithmic or arithmetic logic unit, excuse me, and that performs all the logical computations. And then your registers are kind of like small little holding areas. Memory cache, these are where things are waiting to be processed. And the buses are the little lines connecting everything together. So these little yellow lines that you see, those are called buses. And that's where data and power are transmitted. Questions so far? Just kind of getting to know the geography of a CPU. All right. So when you're going to select a CPU for your motherboard, some things you got to take into place. Motherboard restrictions. What is the CPU architecture? What brand of CPU do you need? Memory cache, the chipsets that are allowed to be used, multi-processing capabilities, set dual processors, multi-core processing, multi-threading. We're going to kind of get into this as we go. Then you have CPUs, features. Does it support virtualization? Almost all do now, but around this time, it was still kind of a newish thing. Also, does the CPU itself have integrated graphics? What kind of security does it have in place? So all these things, depending on your needs, the motherboard's capabilities, and everything that you have are going to kind of go into play when you are trying to determine what CPU you need to use for your machine. So clock speed, we talked about that. That's set by the quartz crystal in the motherboard itself. And the CPU's clock speed is the maximum speed it can attain, not the speed at which it must run. So, they'd be like saying your car's clock speed is 150 miles an hour. That would be like its maximum capability, but if you go running your car at 150 miles an hour all the time, what do you think is going to happen other than getting pulled over on a regular basis? What do we think is going to happen to the car mechanically if I'm driving it at full speed?
It'll break down much faster.
Put more wear and tear on it.
Wear and tear, it's going to break down a lot faster. Same thing goes with CPUs. So this is where overclocking can be dangerous. So this is essentially the same as like redlining your car. Trying to push it beyond its capabilities. And though you may be able to do this for short periods of time, doing this over and over eventually wears down the chips faster. All right. So CPU architecture. So here we have three, and there's a fourth one we'll talk about as well. Three we got here is the 32-bit processors. These are kind of becoming legacy, but they still are out there in the wild. So you will come across them on your day-to-day activities, especially if you work in certain industries, like if you work for state agencies, if you work for the school districts, if you work in places like transportation, things like that, where it doesn't necessarily need to be the new, biggest, baddest, fastest thing on the market. You can get by with older machines. So 32-bit architecture is not going to be a hindrance. And only when we reached Windows 11 are they no longer making 32-bit versions of the operating systems. with regards to the Windows machines. So Windows 10 even had a 32-bit version. And these are typically known as x86 processors. I don't know why they called it that. I'm guessing 1986 is when it came out. That's just what they wanted to stick with. I haven't had an opportunity to look into it and find out. But the 32-bit architectures typically are notated as x86, where 64-bit is notated as x64 because it has 64 bits. Now, 64-bit processors require a 64-bit operating system, but they can handle 32-bit applications. So they can simulate down to a lower level processor in order to run these applications. However, a 32-bit requires a 32-bit operating system and cannot run 64-bit applications. You can't train it to be better. I cannot train a Honda Civic to run like a Lamborghini, but I can drive a Lamborghini like a Honda Civic, right? And then you have the hybrid processors, which essentially can handle either architecture. So you have the x86 and the x64. And they can handle 32-bit or 64-bit operating systems, which is nice. And then the other type that we have are called ARM processors. Sorry about that. So we have ARM processors. And I'm trying to find it real quick. Oh, here we go. So the ARM, I always forget this acronym, is Advanced RISC Machines. And this is an acronym within an acronym. These are still relatively new. And RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. And these are really nice because they have essentially, they take less energy and it takes less computational power to perform a lot of similar tasks. So these work really, really, really well in things like phones, netbooks, tablets, smaller devices where you do need pretty good degree of computing power, but you don't need the heavy lifting of a full-blown desktop. So this gets you really close, but not all the way there. But it opens up a lot of functionality within these lower devices. Questions with regards to that? I skipped off my thing here. Sorry about that. So questions about ARM chips. So it's relatively new, typically in mobile devices and smaller laptops, things like that. So like a Chromebook would have an ARM chip in it. All right. So two things you hear come up a lot: multi-core and multi-threading. What do we mean by that? Well, multi-core typically means you have multiple CPUs within a single chipset. So if you hear of the quad-core processor, it means they have 4 cores, 4 CPUs in a single chipset. So a single chip that you would install actually would have 4 CPUs within it. And then you have multi-threading or multi-processing. And this essentially means that each processor or core on each processor can process 2 sets of instructions at the same time, which is awesome. And to your computer, if you have a multi-core, it makes a CPU seem like it's acting like 2. So if you have a 4-core processor, when you look at the number of processors you have in your computer, it's going to show you 8 if you're operating with multi-threading, because each processor can handle 2 sets of instructions. So your computer will view them as 2 processors, each one. So if you have a 4-core processor, your computer views it like 8. If you have a 2-core, your computer views it like 4. Does this make sense? So multi-core means the number of CPUs on the processor. Then multi-threading, multi-processing, or hyper-threading. Those are three different words, you know, because they had to be copyrighted. So Intel's is called hyper-threading. AMD's is called multi-threading, but these are both versions of multi-processing. All right. So multi-threading, multi-processing. Now we get to some of the fun stuff. So multi-core, like we just said, this is the number of CPUs. So this is kind of like a simplified version of it. So you have 4 literal CPUs in a single chipset. And this would be if we took the cover off of your CPU, this is what it would look like. So in here you have 4 CPUs right here. Boom, 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 boom. Nice. Does anybody, what does this look like to y'all? Can anybody tell me what this kind of looks like here?
Memory slot.
Kind of looks like a memory slot. Okay. It's an interesting one.
A car,
Looks like a what?
vehicle.
A vehicle? Okay. Kind of hard to see, but it looks like a little metal piece of metal with a bunch of little fins sticking up from it. That look familiar to anything else we used?
The motherboard.
Motherboard? What on the motherboard?
Looks like a heat sink.
There you go, heat sink. So even down at the CPU level, it's very important that we're paying attention to, you know, heat management. So even inside the CPU, we're going to have little heat sinks to try to disperse any residual heat that we can. So you see this all over. We saw it in the GPUs. You'll see it on the motherboard, you know, in any like big containers. You may have heat sinks already set in there because we're trying to manage the heat as best as we can because computers produce a lot of heat. Now, we need to talk about memory cache. So we talked about it earlier in this, where we were talking about the, where is it? Here. So we have the internal memory cache inside the processor itself, right? So back to here, we need to talk about, there are 3 different levels of cache memory inside of a CPU. So you have, get my annotator going here. We have a level 1 cache or L1 cache. And can y'all see that, or do I need another color?
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. So we have L1 caches. And that was like the one that we were looking at earlier when we were looking inside the processor. And each CPU has its own L1 cache. Now, for the amount of memory you're using, this is the most expensive, but it's also hands down the fastest because it doesn't have to travel any distance. It is inside the chip. So it's inside the processor, hands down, most expensive you can have, but there's not a lot of it. And then we have our L2 caches. And each chip has its own L2 for each processor, excuse me. And it sits just outside of each chip. So it's not as fast as the L1, but it's pretty darn fast. But it's also not as expensive. You can see them over here in the yellow. Boom, 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 boom. Those are your L2 caches in the chip. So that's L1, that's within each processor. Fastest, most expensive, and the least amount. L2, each processor has its own. It's not quite as fast as L1, not quite as expensive, but it's still pretty quick. And then we get an L3. And all processors share the L3. So that would be like this right here. So all processors share the L3. And it's the least expensive of the three, but the slowest of the three. So it's kind of like RAM. This is short-term memory. Yeah, memory cache. And this is where the CPU is dumping stuff off because it can't hold all the information that it's got to calculate at one time. So it has to keep handing stuff off. So for important stuff that's not a lot of space that it's going to need immediately, it hands it off to L1. And then it kind of cascades out to L2, L3. Once it gets beyond L3, then it's kicking it out to RAM. When RAM gets full, it's kicking it off to virtual memory in our page or swap files. So it's kind of a cascading effect as it's needing stuff held, depending on its size and its how important that excuse me, the importance of the information or the immediacy that it's going to be needed. Questions on this? L1, L2, L3.
Kelly, so is L3 underneath that heatsink?
I believe that's where it's located.
Okay, thanks.
All right, then we move on. And this kind of just explains what we were talking about. It's the L1, L2, L3. And then, and this is essentially, like Vishon had mentioned, this is essentially very, very high speed RAM, but not very large in size, but very, very closely located to the processors. And remember, like real estate, in computing, location, location, location. The closer you are to the source of processing, the faster your information can be processed, which is why in motherboards, the North Bridge has essentially been integrated into the CPU. So it's basically inside of it now. They don't have an external North Bridge for the most part. You still will see them, but the most recent ones, it's been integrated. And now they're even starting to integrate the South Bridge into the CPU. So the more we can integrate in, the closer we can get the stuff together, the faster the computations can take place. All right, questions, comments, concerns? All right. So here's a kind of a breakdown of what it would look like. So you have your 4 cores. You have your L2, you have your L1s on top, you have your L2s right outside, and then the shared L3 among the 4. And you have the memory controller, which determines basically how the information is going to be shared among the 4 cores, especially with regarding to the L3 cache, because it's a lot of shared time. You can actually go into your system with your detailed system information, and you can actually go under your caches and check and see how much storage you have in each level cache you have. As you can see, it's not very big. So like an L1 cache is only 32 kilobytes. Doesn't seem like a lot, does it? L2, 256 kilobytes. Bigger, but really not that much information, you know. Most emails are bigger than this. And then you get to your L3, and it gets up to the 15 megabyte range. But bearing in mind that these caches are only going to be holding on to information for like a fraction of a second. And then it's going to be handed right back to the ALU or the core so that it can process that information. There we go. All right, security. So you have the execute disable bit, or EDB. It's built into a processors, and Intel and AMD kind of have their own name for this. This has the XD or NX. You'll see this as a requirement in a lot of operating systems, especially like Windows 8, 8.1, and 10 required that your chips had either XD or NX capabilities to add increased security. And the nice thing is it can work with the operating system to kind of designate an area of memory for holding data and instructions. So it makes it a little easier. And then the data that are stored in these areas are not executed, which is great because it prevents what's called a buffer overflow attack, where viruses or attackers essentially will continually make requests in order to essentially overload the memory and then causing the system to kind of crash. And so it's not a perfect system, but it did mitigate a lot of attacks. And this particular security bit will kind of mitigate any attempts to run code from areas of memory that are assigned to perform other tasks. All right. This is something that can be enabled within your BIOS or UEFI screen. And the nice thing is it can, for the most part, or in large part, stop malware from executing. Now, also within terms of encryption, these securities protocols will talk with a firmware chip that's on your motherboard. And this firmware chip is called the TPM, which stands for Trusted Platform Module. This will become important when we start talking about security, especially with regards to Windows 11. The TPM, it kind of holds the keys to the castle. So when I encrypt a hard drive, if I use something called BitLocker and I fully encrypt my hard drive, the TPM, or this Trusted Platform Module, which is a firmware chip that is soldered on, a physical chip soldered onto my motherboard, that is where the keys lie in encrypting or decrypting my hard drive. And why this is important is somebody, I'm sure you guys have seen like TV shows or something like that, where they'll go in and they'll just snatch the hard drives out of a computer and walk out with those rather than walking out with the whole computer. You know what I mean? Anybody ever seen Leverage? They did this a couple times on there. They'll just grab the hard drives and they walk out with the hard drives or whatever. If you have BitLocker, which is an encryption level with the TPM, it's going to be insanely difficult to break that encryption, because the encryption is going to be based upon that hard drive being connected to that motherboard. And if you don't have the keys to the castle, it's hard to break. So that is, one thing that we do have to remember. So TPM, Trusted Platform Module. Basically. And then the thing is yeah. And if you consider the fact that like when they're stealing those, it's typically from like research and development of a big corporation, I guarantee you they had high level encryption on those. So, might have taken quite a while to get past it. All right, virtualization. So we talked about virtual memory. Who remembers what virtual memory is? Anybody?
Like the cloud?
Not in the cloud. But
Like the page
I like
file
where your
on
head's
your
at,
hard
Michelle.
drive?
yes, like the swap file and the page file on your hard drive. So it's virtual because it's not when we say memory, what are we talking about?
RAM.
RAM, right? So not a bad guess there, Sean. But yeah. So the page file and the swap file is virtual because we're going to be using our hard drive virtually like a RAM memory module, right? So what do we call our hard drive? So it's not memory. What is it?
Storage.
Storage. So RAM modules, that's memory. Hard drive is storage. And then we use our storage as virtual memory. So getting kind of an idea of virtual means. So we have virtualization. And what virtualization means is essentially we can simulate other computers by utilizing the resources of our computer. So essentially we can create multiple computers with a single one, which is awesome, especially for those of us in IT who may have to test whether or not software is going to have a negative impact on the system or an update. We don't have to have one of each type of computer sitting in our office. We can create virtual machines to run exactly the way these machines would. So long as your motherboard supports it, and then the UEFI and BIOS you have, it's been turned on and supports it, you can create these virtual machines on your computer. In fact, you will be doing that highly likely in this class. And one of the things we have to take into account is you can essentially have one instance or one machine per core that you have. And if you have multiprocessing, remember, a multiprocessor, this is where it becomes important. So a single core with multiprocessing capabilities acts like two, right? Then you can have an additional virtual machine because of the multiprocessing for each core. The only thing you have to bear in mind is you need one for the host. So for your computer, you still need to have one core operating, but if you have a 4-core processor with multi-threading capabilities, then you can run up to 7 virtual machines on there at one time. All right, integrated graphics. Some processors have them kind of, built-in GPUs, which are nice. They tend not to be super awesome, but they're usually pretty good. And they essentially will manipulate the graphic data into the images that you see on your screens. They've gotten significantly better over the last few years with now 4K and 8K displays and all that kind of fun stuff. And still not good enough for the games because games tend to be a little bit ahead of this. So if you're getting into games or video processing or animation or engineering, you need something with a little more power involved in the GPU. So you may get something like a graphics card like we talked about last week. And you would have the GPU built in to that graphics card itself. And really nice, it can handle a lot more detailed imagery. It can process a lot more information. And so that would just be considered a GPU or graphics card. But when it's built into the main chip and we utilize it there, it is considered to be an integrated graphics. And most of us are using that right now. How many of us here have upgraded graphics cards in our computers? Spot the gamers right away. There we go. So that takes a lot of weight off the CPU. Nice thing, they also come with built-in RAM, so it also takes a load off of our RAM modules as well, because we don't have to worry about the graphics processing eating up a lot of our memory. All right, here's the CPU sockets. We talked about this briefly last week, but we'll get into it a little bit more. We have, 2 separate flavors here, essentially. We have the PGA or pin grid array. It's got the pins sticking up out of it. It's much easier to see on this than with the one we were using last week. So you can see all the little pins sticking up. And then you have the LGA or land grid array. Easy to remember because it's flat like the land. And let's see here real quick, grab a name. Andre, can you tell me what manufacturer uses the LGA or land grid array? Got a 50-50 shot. Intel, excellent. Nice work. Yes, that is Intel, which leaves us the PGA is what company? So we know Intel does one. Anita, can you tell me who the other company is? That would be the PGA or Pin Grid Array. Are you there, Anita? Oh, you're getting a lot of help in chat, by the way. There you go. AMD. Excellent. So AMD, PGA, Intel, LGA. So nice thing is you should be able to look at a motherboard and tell right off the bat without seeing any instructions whether it's an AMD or an Intel motherboard. And here's one already put into its socket and locked down with the ZIF or zero insertion force. You can see this little control arm right here that kind of locks the cage down. And they've already put the thermal paste on the back of the CPU, so they're ready to apply the heat sink. And here's a bunch of Intel sockets, which is awesome. So we got to look through all of this, and it gives you all this wonderful detailed information, which is great to know. And you're probably sitting there asking yourself, do I really need to know all this stuff? Do I need to sit down and memorize this stuff? Is this important for me to, really dive into? And the answer is no. You may come across one question on the exam that has to do with chip sockets. However, understanding how they name things will likely get you the correct answer. So LGA sockets, remember land grid array, flat sockets here. So an LGA socket, they list all their sockets as LGA. Makes it kind of easy. So at worst, you'll get yourself down to 50-50 if they have two AMD sockets and two Intel sockets. So LGA has LGA socket names. Make sense? Now, AMD likes to play a little bit of games, but we'll get into that here in a second. So here's a look at some LGA sockets. You can see the pins kind of sticking up out of the sockets themselves. They're all a little different, but you have flat little connectors on your chips, and each one of these has to correspond with a specific pin. Now, say the chip was perfectly square, didn't have any little notches or anything like that. Majid, can you tell me what on the chip in the motherboard would indicate how I line up my chips? How would I know how to line up my chip?
Dang, he beat me to it.
So
The
Majid,
gold arrow, it's the little gold arrow on the CPU.
thank you, Justin. Yes, the gold arrow. What does the gold arrow signify?
The orientation. Well, you
Okay,
got to match it
how?
up. There's another arrow on the CPU socket.
You are correct. You are correct. But I'm looking a little bit deeper than that. So what does the golden arrow signify? Before we even put the chip in, the golden arrow is telling us something other than orientation.
L1.
You're knocking on the right door, Majid. What is it?
Does it
L1.
show you where the,
Not L1.
I was gonna say, does it show you where the power
Okay.
socket is?
Not the power
Okay.
socket. Think about it in terms of the pins. So it works for power plugs too. That golden triangle means the same thing no matter where it is. And yes, it helps with orientation, but it's telling us something very specific. won't torture you too much longer. It is the spot closest to pin 1. So if I'm doing any kind of repair or any kind of maintenance on it, I know where pin 1 is located. So that's what the triangle tells us. So we know where pin 1 is by the triangle, and then the triangle on the chip tells us where pin 1 is on the chip, so we can orient the chip correctly and set it in. And all the pins will line up correctly after that. So the triangle represents pin 1. All right. Questions on that so far?
Yeah, where's the gold arrow on the image? I can't see it.
They had the cage closed on it, so it's hard to see on here. There's a better image of it a little bit later, and I'll show you. So when we get another image of the board, I'll show you where it's at. All right, AMD. More sockets to know. Now, AM, you think of this like old school radio, AM, FM. So AMD goes with the FM sockets. So AM, FM. And again, you don't have to memorize all these, but at least knowing how the naming is set up will at least get you down to a 50-50 on the exam, because as we all know in real life, we can always consult our coworker Google as to what socket we need for that chip, right? All right. Then we'll take a look at some AMD sockets. Nope. Nope, too far. So here you go. Here's some AMD sockets. As you can see, these just, it's like a flat piece of plastic, and it's got a bunch of little pins sticking in there. And hard to see. There is a triangle right here, which is for pin 1. It's not yellow. Again, we'll show one on the board here in a little bit. There's one there, there's one here, and there's one right here. It's hard to see on here. There's a better example of it a little bit later. Andre, I'm not going to lie to you. You would be shocked at how much of a percentage of, or how much of a determinant of how good of an IT professional you are is how good you can Google. Because there are different levels of being able to search for things. You know, having a base knowledge can help you eliminate 99% of the returns you'll get. So there's a difference between saying, my computer is not able to connect to the internet, and saying, I'm unable to connect with the DHCP server. You're going to get drastically different results. So being an efficient Googler is really, really going to help you, especially in the first few years. Exactly, Brendan. All right. There we go. CPU heat. Definitely an issue. As we've stated a couple times, the CPU can go from room temperature to about 500 degrees in about 2 to 3 seconds, which is insanely fast. So we have to find ways of mitigating or managing that heat. Most common way is the heat sink fan method. Most computers come with it this way. This is typically how it's handled. And basically what it is, you have the CPU. They put some thermal paste in the CPU, put a heat sink on top of that. The heat sink then has a fan put on top of it. The fan helps force the air down through the heat sink, allowing for pretty efficient cooling. They do have what's called passive cooling, which just has a heat sink, but that's typically not sufficient for a CPU. That would be for other chipsets like your Northbridge. So that would be what's called passive cooling. So we utilize that. And then you have your case fans, which draw air in. Typically cold air goes in through the front, hot air out the back. And then you have the heatsink fan method set up here. All well and good. Awesome stuff. Yes.
When it comes down to the case fans, I just looking at them, it just causes confusion for me because I never know like which way the airflow is supposed to be going.
They typically have an arrow on it that'll show you airflow.
Oh, okay.
So on it, it'll have an arrow to show you like, whether the air is going through this way or it's going through that way. And then you can just flip it around how you need it. But you want to draw air in the front and out the back. That's typically an
front, out the
industry
back.
standard. Mhm.
Oh, and another tip is if the side with the grill is usually exhaust and the side without the grill is usually intake.
There you
All right, thank you guys.
go. When in doubt, refer to the documentation. So other than those kinds, they do have other types that you will come across. You have the liquid cooling, which is pretty popular among the gaming crowd, partly due to aesthetics, partly due to being more efficient in its cooling and being quieter. The liquid cooling down here in the bottom works a lot like a radiator in a car, where it takes the hot water away from the engine, puts it into the heatsink fan blades, where it kind of blows air through it and cools it down, and then sends the cool liquid back down another tube into the engine again to get warmed up. And it kind of just pushes through in a cycle. Much more efficient than just the heatsink and fan, and also, again, much quieter, but also more expensive. So,
I have a question, I'm sorry.
yes, go ahead.
We're about the submersible system. I've always wondered, I guess I could have just looked this up, but I've always wondered, when do you change out the oil?
I mean, it honestly would depend about the level of debris you're building up. It may say, and it also may depend on the system. They may say after so many computational hours or cycles. So like however many hours of runtime, you may need to swap out the oil, kind of like a car.
Okay.
So yeah, submersible systems like this, it is quite literally a computer just submerged in liquid. Kind of cool. Tends to be one of the most expensive ways to keep it cool, but it's also the absolute hands down most effective way to do it. And it uses a type of like specialized mineral oil to keep the system running and cool. And it doesn't conduct electricity, so you don't have to worry about shorts or any of that stuff. But if you want to, have a computer in a fish tank on your desk, you can do that if you wish. There's also open
Excuse
air. Yes, go ahead.
How do you go about replacing those parts that are submerged in the oil?
What do you mean?
Like you said the entire system is submerged. Like, would I buy it like that, or what happens if like something goes bad? How do you replace?
Pull it
a
out of the
specific
oil,
part?
replace the parts you need, put it back in.
Would you dry it off? I mean,
That,
will you wipe it?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think
Yeah,
so
that's
because it's not
essentially what I'm
conductive oil.
asking.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to, because as you're pushing the pieces in, it's going to force out the liquid. It's going to get in the cracks and crevices anyway. That's the point.
Okay.
So I don't think you need to. There may be specific components that you may need to, but that may be about it. So they also have open air computers, which, again, when I started talking about like pieces of art, like the things that people come up with, is pretty impressive. This over here. I mean, so you can see some of these. These are like quite literally just mounted on people's walls, open air. They kind of scatter them about. They have different themes. Like this one was like Bumblebee. And people just kind of showing off their systems in different ways. But if you're gonna have an open air system like this, liquid cooling is a requirement. You cannot use the passive air cooling because you don't have control over the airflow. But a lot of people take pride in these things and build out some pretty amazing systems. So just kind of an example of that real quick. So submersible and liquid. For the most part, in enterprise settings, you won't come across those two unless you're in a very, very high, like if you're doing IT for like an animation company or graphics processing or engineering firms where they're going to be using lots of computing power, then you may be getting into liquid cooling and stuff like that. But your standard offices and stuff like that, not typically. It's mostly going to be the heat sink and fan method. All right. Steps to removing a CPU. Some of this will seem familiar. So most of them will have a arm like this, little cage that pops open. That is called a ZIF, or zero insertion force. And you would open that up by kind of pushing down the little arm, unhooking it, and then swinging it back over. I have a video that's going to show it here in just a minute or two. Except he doesn't make one small error. What's wrong with these pictures down here? Can anybody tell me?
He's touching the edge.
What should he be doing?
Extractor.
Yeah.
Exactly, Vishon. Should be using a chip extractor. So we'll let it pass for purposes. All right. You typically, yeah, you do hold it by the edges, but again, chip extractor is your best bet. Only once it's removed, do you take the new CPU from the bag or box that you contain. I know once you get one in your hands, you're all excited. You want to take it out, look at it. It's pretty, it's awesome. You want to just kind of like hold it up to the sun and just be like, yes. But no, we want to wait until we're actually going to install this thing so we don't run the risk of dropping it and damaging it. So only then, when you're ready to install it, do you pull it out and get ready to place it in the socket. Okay, look carefully. You're going to look for pin 1. You can see it right here on this chip, and you can see it on the board right here. And then over here, you can see it on this corner. It's kind of hard to see, but also on the board down here. But we have other examples we'll show you where it's a little bit easier to see. Most chips nowadays, though, thankfully have notches that make it easy to align it so you can't put it in wrong. But it's still good to know these things, if not just for trivia night. All right, so once you put it in, drop the cage on it, use the locking arm to hook it in place. Then you apply your thermal paste, only about a P's worth or a pencil eraser, any more than that. And you're going to be doing some cleanup before you start, or before you have to reapply and start over. Any less than that, and you're likely going to be dealing with a damaged CPU. So roughly the size of a P or pencil eraser. But most heat sinks come with it already applied, so that helps. All right. Once you have the thermal paste on, put the heat sink on top of the processor, secure it to the board. If it has screws, use the X method of applying the screws. If it has clips like the one here, punch the clips in an X pattern. So you're not going, 1, 2, 3, 4, which can run the risk of flexing or damaging it. You do 1, 2, 3, 4 in a cross pattern. All right. Oops, let me stop here. Got to share sound. There we go. When we start playing, give me the thumbs up that you hear volume.
Hi there, this is Ranjit from tech2bus.com, and in this video we're going to install
Intel processor on this motherboard, and the motherboard that you're seeing is an Asus motherboard based on the Intel Z77 chipset. And this supports both the Sandy Bridge and the Ivy Bridge chips based on the LGA socket 1155, and I'm going to use a LGA 1155 chip on the same. And the general thing before attempting to do something like this is that you notice this is the motherboard, and the thing that you have to keep in mind is any static electricity that you might have built up should be dissipated before even you touch the motherboard, because it can damage the motherboard. So I suggest wearing a anti static wristband or grounding yourself before attempting to do the same. And for this test, let me move the motherboard. I'm using a stock Intel kit in which we get this CPU cooler and the chip itself. And if you take out the CPU cooler, as you see, the thermal paste is already pre-applied. So I'm not going to apply the thermal paste here. But if you're using an aftermarket air cooler or something like that, you might need to apply the thermal paste on the chip. And this is the actual motherboard. Let me just zoom in a little bit, because this is the area where we're going to work. And the first thing you do is gently press this and move this and open this latch, and this latch will open this way. And now you need to open the processor that you have. Do notice that this is the processor and you should not touch this area. Gently lift it, and let me just move the motherboard, and let me show you one more thing that is a little bit important. Let me see. Yeah, if you notice here, you can see these two notches, and on the socket of the motherboard also you will have similar two notches. Let me bring the motherboard now, and as you can see, here are the two notches. So, and we also have an arrow over here, and we have an arrow on this. So you just gently place the chip and it should sit down. And now what you have to do is bring back this plate like this and depress the lever. Do note that you might have to apply a little bit of pressure. That is okay. Now you have installed the chip. Now what you have to do is, now we are going to install this fan on the same, and to do that it's also pretty easy. Let me show you the motherboard actually. Let me just zoom out a little bit. And if you notice, we have these 4 holes over here, and our stock Intel cooler will mount there. And let me just zoom in a bit so you get a better view. And what we do is we gently place this over here, over the 4 holes approximately, and those 4 pins should just go down gently. And now what we do is hold on to the processor like this and just depress, and you'll get a clicking sound. And do the same for the next one and proceed with the others. You should get this clicking sound that you have heard. That means we have fixed the CPU cooler. And now the last thing that we need to do is, let me show you the same. Your motherboard should have a header like this known as the CPU fan, and you now just need to attach the CPU fan and that's it. And that's how you have installed your CPU on your motherboard. And let me just turn the motherboard 1 second. And if you look at the back, I want to show these tiny pins. They should come out. That means you have successfully properly installed the stock Intel CPU cooler. So that's how you actually install Intel CPU on a motherboard, and in my next video I'll be installing the other.
All right, so other than using a chip extractor, that's a pretty good demonstration. All right. Good question here, Takia. Can you please tell me if I have a 3-pin connector on my motherboard and a 4-pin connector on my fan, what do I do?
You can still use it.
Okay. Can you elaborate?
You can still use the 3-pin on the 4-pin.
Okay, excellent. Do we remember what the 4th pin was for?
No.
No? Okay, that's fair. Do you want to phone a friend? Although you are getting some aid in the chat. Oh, we lost her. Fan speed. So it just determines whether, like, how fast the fan is moving. With regards to the 3-pin, it would just be the fan either all the way on or all the way off. So good one to remember. All right.
Oh, so kind of question
Yes.
about that one because one of the
Yeah, go ahead,
labs,
Jose.
the motherboard lab, there was when I connected the fan, I guess I connected to the 3-pin, not the 4-pin. And so what I ended up doing is when I turn on the computer, it just turned on and shut off right away. I'm like, okay. So on labs like that, if there's a 4-pin, you have to use the 4-pin, correct?
I'm gonna have to look and see which lab you're talking about.
It's the one where you disconnect the motherboard. I think motherboard installation, something like that. I'll have to go back and look, but it was one of the earlier
I don't think it
labs.
was I don't think it was the fan that was causing the problem with that. It was probably the motherboard you were using.
Oh, the motherboard? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because once I switched it over to the 4-pin, it started working normal.
Okay.
I
So
started finding it weird.
I'll double check and see what you were talking about.
Okay.
But I think it was something other than the pin prongs and the fan blade at that point. But we'll take a look at it.
Okay.
All right. Well, some pitfalls you may come across: old pin grid array. So if you have an AMD processor and it's stuck in the socket, got to be careful on this, because if you use a little too much force and you pull it out, you might break off some of the pins inside the socket. To try to avoid this, use balanced force when pulling it. Don't try to wrench it and twist it off. If you're lucky, if you break off a pin, you might be able to extract them with tweezers. But I wouldn't bank on that. The other issue is thermal paste has fused the CPU to the heatsink. Solution to this, they say keep the CPU locked in the socket, unlatch, they unscrew the heatsink board, and slowly and carefully twist the heatsink to dislodge. Does anybody remember the other method we talked about last week? Something you might want to keep in your bag?
Floss.
Floss, right? Unscented, unwaxed dental floss. And you just put it on one side of the processor in between the heatsink and the processor, and you just kind of saw your way through it, and that'll dislodge the heatsink as well. So a little bit less risky than grabbing that heatsink and twisting it.
I have a question.
The other one, yes, absolutely.
So we know that the CPU and the heatsink are attached using a heatsink. So what attaches the CPU, the heatsink and the CPU fan?
Typically, they kind of come together, but it could also just be screws holding them together or clips, because they're usually going to come as a unit. So like the one that gentleman was using, those were built together. Older ones, they have screws threaded through them, so the screws actually hold the fan on. But that's typically sort of usually be screws or clips holding it on there. I don't know, Emilio. I guess I mean, technically you could, but if it's dry and kind of glued on there, it may not work. So, but yeah, I guess you could do that. Yeah, I guess, never mind. So, I don't know. I've never heard anybody trying that, but see. Might have to look and see if somebody attempted that one. All right. Other CPU problems, typically they tend to not have issues on them. But when they do have issues, they tend to be catastrophic. Heat sink malfunctions would tend to be a problem. So like if it's powering up and then shutting off as it's powering up, you know, it could be a heat issue. It also could be the motherboard itself not maintaining constant flow of power. So first thing you might want to check, least invasive, make sure the heat sink is properly adhered and the fan is actually working. Catastrophic issues, or kind of what they are, the system can't boot. You'll just get a series of beeps, which those series of beeps are called what? What do we call these series of beeps?
Post error.
Post error, power on self-test. Very good, Sean. And then you would just check the motherboard documentation, see what the code means, and it would basically tell you if the problem was with the CPU or not. Like it's not able to detect it or something along those lines, or it doesn't recognize it, which also happens. One other thing you want to pay attention to with regards to motherboards, like if you're deciding to build your own system, one place that people like to go to a lot to building their own system is PC Part Picker. You can go, you can kind of design your own system there, and it'll tell you for the most part if the system works or not. If the parts are compatible, if everything works together. The one thing you always got to pay attention to is the CPU and motherboard configuration. Because a lot of times, or many times, there may be an asterisk next to it. And what it means is, down the bottom, it may say that the motherboard requires an upgrade in order to be able to work with this CPU. Now, if you're upgrading a current system, like you're just getting a new CPU or whatnot, that's fine. You can use your old processor to upgrade your motherboard to be able to accept the new one. But if you're going from scratch and you're building a system from nothing, you're not going to be able to use that motherboard with that new CPU because you won't be able to upgrade the motherboard without an older CPU to handle it. So this is something to pay attention to when you're putting parts together. Pay attention to any like little side notes that there may be. Questions regarding this? We're so quiet today. Kind of wraps it up. Should be able to describe the various types of processors and architectures. So we have the Intel LGA, we have the AMD PGA, we have the ARM architecture, which is our mobile devices and smaller computers. We talked a little bit about the internal workings of the CPU, the L1, L2, L3 cache. We talked about the memory controllers, the ALUs, how it kind of works with the motherboard, how it kind of fits into it. And then we talked about choosing the appropriate CPU, common pitfalls, some symptoms to look out for, and working into it. Any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, revelations?
I just real quick, if you could just go over one more quick time about ARM. I'm sorry.
ARM, yes. So ARM, those are the acronym basically stands for Advanced Risk Machines. And it's an acronym within an acronym. So RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. And they are lower power processors, and they tend to be utilized in all-in-ones, smaller laptops, mobile devices, tablets, things like that, Chromebooks, because they're lighter weight. And they're more efficient than using smaller, lower power versions of the Intel or AMD chips. So they work out to being a pretty good substitute. And they get you close to using a laptop as like or a tablet as a desktop replacement. There's like a huge race going on with that between, various Windows machines and Macs as well. They're trying to find the tablet that can replace the laptop or the desktop. And most tablets can for the majority of people in usage. If you're just using it for email and entertainment, tablet is perfectly fine. But they're trying to get into the lightweight office work as well. So, makes sense, Andrew?
Yeah, thank you. We don't use ARM in phones, right?
I believe they may. I have to double check.
Oh, yeah, we
That's
do.
what we use for phones and Apple devices. Mostly
Mhm.
nowadays, that's what we've been using, and it's
Yeah.
becoming faster.
Yeah.
So, yep. Another thing that we didn't have a slide for in here or in the motherboard one is they do have what are called multi-socket motherboards, which is a motherboard that can take multiple CPUs, typically in servers, but they do have personal use ones that can take 2 to 4 CPUs, like whole chips. And those are typically used for, people who are going to be doing a lot of virtualization, things like that. It's a multi-socket motherboard. Any other questions?
I know we went over this before, but obviously in cell phones you can't put a heat sink. So
You can.
do you use passive cooling?
You can. Well, I mean, heatsink is passive cooling.
Okay.
So yeah, they do have heat sinks inside of a phone.
Okay.
So let me pull one up here real quick. Trying to find one with like the covers off where I can see. But yeah, absolutely. Inside the chips and inside the phone itself, they do utilize heat sinks. I'll have to find a good image of it. So good question though.